So it's really good to be with you all today as we continue on with our Live Better series. And of course, in our Live Better series, we address different topics that are helpful in living a healthy and happy life. One of the key themes, as you might remember, and it's right up here on the top of the handout, is I can live a vital and meaningful life. And of course, that's something that we all want, isn't it? To live a vital life and to also to live a life with meaning. And then today's particular talk, we're going to be talking about healthy perspectives in addressing chronic illness. Now, probably many of you who are here in the audience today, and those of you that are watching on video, probably many of you have a chronic illness, or you might have a family member or a loved one who has a chronic illness. So when we're talking about a chronic illness, what we're talking about is an illness that doesn't go away. So if we have a cold, that's an acute illness, that goes away. If we break our leg, that gets healed up and then it goes away. But when we're talking about a chronic illness, we're talking about something that we need to address every day of our lives. And hopefully, by having good attitudes and good healthy practices, we lessen the impact that the illness has in our life. And we also learn lessons from that illness where in fact we get stronger. So some examples of what I'm talking about when we're talking about a chronic illness, we're talking about illnesses like multiple sclerosis, or Parkinson's, or congestive heart failure, or COPD, or schizoaffective disorder, or diabetes, or bipolar disorder. These are illnesses that they just don't go away, do they, you guys? These are illnesses that we need to learn the proper mental attitude, the proper emotional approach, and then certain skillful physiological approaches to deal with these illnesses so that we really lessen the impact that they have in our life. And so today, as we do in all of our classes, we're going to be addressing these chronic illnesses from the perspective of acceptance and commitment therapy. So, as we often do, when we talk about acceptance and commitment therapy, we want to be taking a look at this little image that we frequently talk about, and it's right here on your handouts. And we start off with the Bluebird of Happiness, and that is all of us knowing that I want to and I can live a vital and meaningful life. Now, in order to do that, what are some things that we need to do? So especially when we're dealing with a chronic illness, we can still have a chronic illness and still live a vital and meaningful life. One of the things that we'll need to do, and that's where the glasses come in here, we need to have a new pair of glasses. We need to say, I need to look at my illness and I need to look at myself in a new way. I need to have a different perspective on how I deal with my illness. The next thing, of course, that we want to do is the beach ball. So we have our beach ball with ACT therapy. And so many of us, when different thoughts or feelings come up, we just don't want to deal with them. We want to push them underwater. And what we find is, when we push these thoughts and feelings underwater, they make us sicker. And so as scary as it is, what we've learned is we want to let these thoughts and feelings come up. I'm going to be talking with you about these in a minute. And those are the 8 psychological stressors that we deal with when we have a chronic illness. We're going to be talking about letting those stressors come up, and so we can deal with them rather than pushing them underwater that makes them worse. So after we let our thoughts and feelings come up, of course, the next thing is the Chinese finger trap, And you might remember that's about accepting life on life's terms, accepting what is as it is, not struggling against it, but embracing it and saying, okay, this is the way it is, I can accept this, now what's next? And so then after we accept what's next, That's where up here the 1, 2, 3 is. And the 1, 2, 3 is where we take a look at our values. And we say, okay, now that I accept that I have this chronic illness, what am I going to do about it? What are my top 3 values? To be a loving person, a kind person, to be courageous, to be knowledgeable, etc. What are my values? And to go ahead and get into action, do Nike therapy. Don't hide under the covers and don't give in to the illness. This is called learning to have our illness without our illness having us. This is what Dr. Viktor Frankl referred to as the defiant power of the human spirit, where we don't let our illness take over our life. We accept our illness through the finger trap, then we identify our 3 values and we say, okay, let's roll with this. What do I need to do to deal with this? Now let's go ahead and back up for a minute, you guys. And let's take a look at the 8 psychological stressors. And again, as we're talking about this, and you might find yourself letting the beach ball come up. These are ideas that go through our mind and we try to push them away. But instead, if this is true for you with your chronic illness, whether you have a chronic physical illness or a chronic mental illness, I want you to learn to let these thoughts and feelings just come up and be there, and then maybe journal about them, or talk to your therapist about them, or talk to your doctor about them, or your minister, your priest, your rabbi, your psychiatrist. So when we have a chronic illness, again like MS, Parkinson's, congestive heart failure, COPD, schizoaffective disorder, bipolar disorder, or diabetes, one of the things that comes to our mind is, I'm not the person that I used to be. Because of this illness, I've lost some of my functioning. And I've lost part of the person that I used to be. Or number 2, another stressor when we have a chronic illness is, people don't treat me the way they used to. Sometimes there's a stigma with a mental illness, or a physical illness. There could be a stigma with that as well. So maybe people treat us in a certain way. Or maybe people are just way too helpful. It's like, hey, I have an illness, but I'm still capable. I'm not like a totally crippled human being here. Let me take care of myself. Let me manage part of my life. A third one is, it seems like life is moving on without me. It seems like because of my illness, I'm stuck. Maybe some of you have felt that, with your illness? Okay, let's look at the 4th one as we turn the page. Sometimes with this illness, because of the symptoms of our illness, and also because we have to have so many medical appointments, and there are so many things that we have to do. Number 4 is we feel like our illness has overtaken our life. It's like, holy mackerel, my whole life I'm going to this meeting, and this appointment, and I want to get out and do this or get out and do that, but because of the symptoms of my illness, I'm not able to do that. So again, do you see that sometimes it's a real struggle to accept our chronic illness and deal with it? Number 5, sometimes because of this illness, we can start to feel and think, my life is no longer meaningful or worthwhile. Sometimes because of the symptoms of our illness and because it takes some of our functioning away, we feel like we've lost our meaning. We feel like we've lost our reason for living. Now that's not true, but it's important we let those thoughts and feelings come up, and that when they come up, we acknowledge them and we deal with them. And you'll hear Dr. Hayes in his television interview talk about these kinds of things today. Number 6, another stressor when we have an illness and we're not functioning as well because we need to be driven, maybe we can't work anymore, maybe we don't have any income coming in, is that we start to feel like I'm a burden to other people. We might say, I'm just a burden to other people and I don't like being a burden to them. These are difficult thoughts and feelings to deal with, but we want to let them come up, you guys, Let them come up and acknowledge they're there, and then talk to somebody about them. Again, talk with your therapist, your your mental health technician, your nurse, your psychiatrist. Talk about these things. Don't push them underwater where they just get bigger and uglier. Let them come up. Number 7, sometimes we say, look at what life has done to me, or sometimes look at what God has done to me. Why do I have this illness? Now that's a normal reaction as we're at first dealing with the symptoms and then the diagnosis of a chronic illness. It's natural that we have that reaction. Again, we want to let that come up, and we want to talk to somebody about that and really engage in the grieving process. Because one of the things that we need to do, part of the acceptance of a chronic illness, whether it's a physical illness or a mental illness, part of that is grieving our losses. And then number 8, I don't want to deal with this and I'm not going to. I'm not going to my appointments. I'm not taking my medications. I'm not going to any stupid meetings. So we rebel against that. That's a natural, normal feeling. So again, but you can tell if we continue functioning that way, we're heading down the wrong road, aren't we? We're going to end up letting our chronic illness take over our life, or we might even become suicidal, huh? And so, again, it's natural and normal. These thoughts and feelings come up, and when they do, we want to acknowledge them and talk again with our nurse, our tech, our counselor, our psychiatrist, and say, let me tell you the truth. Let me tell you what's really going on with me. This is all part of the healing process. Now, I want you to take what we've just talked about with these 8 psychological stressors, and I want them now, we're going to put on Dr. Hayes' video interview. And as he's talking about acceptance and commitment therapy with chronic illness, please, in your mind, apply what we've just been talking about to what Dr. Hayes has to talk about on the interview, okay?
Hello, I'm Tom Lavin. Welcome to New Skills for Living, a show dedicated to healing and wholeness in our community. If you've had a chronic illness or someone that you love has had a chronic illness, you might want to watch our show today, as our guest, Dr. Stephen Hayes, is going to be talking about how to deal with the pain and the suffering of having a chronic illness. Our guest, Dr. Stephen Hayes, is a professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Nevada, Reno. He is the author of this really wonderful and very helpful book, Get Out of Your Mind and Into Your Life. Dr. Hayes, thank you so much for being here.
It's great to be here.
All right. So we're going to be talking about chronic illness today, of course, and chronic illness really deeply affects the lives of people with cardiology problems, chronic pain, all kinds of difficulties in their life. How has ACT research shown that the therapy that you practice, ACT, can be helpful to people?
Well, the challenge that people face from the chronic illness is sort of 2 kinds. You have to face the physical challenges that are there and dealing with things like diabetes, heart disease, pain, and so forth. But there's also the psychological challenge. And often people get very little training in how to do that. Mm-hmm. And some of the things that you're naturally prone to do when you're faced with the challenge of a chronic illness turns out not to be helpful, can even be hurtful. So we try to move some of the things that aren't helpful out of the way, get people focused on things that really work, empower people to step up to the challenge of chronic illness.
What are the things that you've seen? What do people do that when they have a chronic illness and in general it doesn't work?
Some of the worst things you can do are to deny and avoid the problem, to try to push away difficult thoughts and feelings, to talk yourself out of it. Part of what's difficult about that is every time you do healthy things that actually manage an illness, you're going to be reminded of it. And so what tends to happen if you're very avoidant and trying to manipulate your own insides as a way of dealing with the illness is you tend to try to not attend to it. And many of these problems require attention. You have to figure out a way to be able to attend to it in a way that doesn't entangle you, doesn't knock you off center. And that's exactly what's inside the ACT message.
So people, we might tend, if we have a chronic illness, we want it to go away, and we're kind of like an ostrich, and we put our head in the sand, and we hope that if I don't take my medication, if I don't make my doctor's appointment, if I don't talk to my family about these symptoms that I'm having, maybe it'll all go away.
Exactly. You want to pick a good example. Take diabetes. Every time you stick yourself and look at those numbers, you have the possibility of getting some bad news. Even if you get good news, you're reminded that you have a chronic disease that is going to threaten your health for your entire life. It can be managed, but it's very tempting to just avoid dealing with the details of your diet, exercise, monitoring, taking your medications, and then you begin to pay the cost in other ways, so that you're headed down a kind of self-amplifying process of the disease getting on top of you rather than you on top of the disease.
And have you found, like, so on one hand you were saying we can tend to avoid this, have you found that on the other hand someone might get into like hyper-control and just really overly focus on their illness and maybe like become their illness? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Absolutely. You begin to become so focused that and really what's usually inside that is another form of avoidance, such as avoiding the fears around mortality or morbidity. And when you're dealing with a chronic illness, you need to be realistic with yourself and sort of put it in its proper place in your life, so that relationships, recreation, work, all have a proper balance, and that your life doesn't become about the illness, but rather illness is an aspect of it that you're managing in a healthy way.
Okay. So that if someone has diabetes or heart disease or chronic pain, some other chronic illness, your therapy, the way that you help people approach dealing with their chronic illness, helps them to not get into avoidance or not get into the other type of avoidance, over control. Right. Can you tell us about that, please?
Essentially what we do is we teach people to be more accepting of their emotions, more mindful of their thoughts, taking their thoughts from up close to having a little bit of distance on them and just noticing that they're there. Come into the present moment, focus on your values, and get your feet moving. And so that the values that are important generally are not really about the illness, they're about the people in your life or the work that you want to do. And so that gives you the balance. But the acceptance and mindfulness keeps you from the avoidant processes that also are unhelpful. So that combination of acceptance and mindfulness on the one hand and values-based action on the other is the formula that we teach people how to apply.
Dr. Hayes, you were talking about accepting and then being mindful, focusing on values, and then moving our feet. Can you kind of walk us through each of those steps as you might with a patient who's coming to see you?
Well, sure. The acceptance piece, people often are not very aware of what it is that they're feeling, and they tend to sort of say, oh, I can't stand it, or things like that are very global. Often they're not emotions at all. They're more like judgments and evaluations. We teach people to watch what their body is doing, to watch what they're reminded of, what their emotions are, and then to hold them gently. Because these are difficult processes. It's normal to be upset, to have frightening feelings, difficult feelings. We teach people to sort of learn to watch their thoughts the way you might when you're meditating, and to stop struggling with them and stop pushing them away, and to pick and choose which of those are most useful to you in guiding your action without having to argue back and constantly inside a little war inside your head. And then finally we focus on, well, what do you really want your life to be about? You're here, you're alive, yes, you have an illness, we're all going out horizontal. So you do have to face issues of mortality. This is built into it. But while we're alive, what do you want to be about? And what would we have to do in the world of behavior to make your life be about that? So it's a matter of sort of releasing yourself from a struggle and then focusing on what it is that you can do with your moment-by-moment interaction with the people around you, with your work, with the things that you care about.
So that if someone has just been given a diagnosis of type 2 diabetes and they're going, oh my gosh, what does this mean? It means all of a sudden they become aware, I'm going to die. Eventually, I have a body that's not working. So they're full of anxiety. How am I going to tell my wife and the kids?
And people can put themselves in a psychological state in which even the information that they need to know is no longer helpful. We've done research in which we've shown that if we use the American Diabetes Association educational packets, sometimes people are so frightened that even when they hear the information, they're unable to use it. They can tell you what they're supposed to do, but it's too difficult. And so we try to create a more receptive ground. It's like tilling the soil so you can plant a seed in which some information that may be frightening, but it's also empowering. But how do you monitor your blood glucose? What do you have to do with diet and exercise? And yes, what are you going to do with your family, and what are they, and the questions that are going to be asked of you, and so forth. Some of those are going to be difficult.
Yeah.
Some of those are going to be painful. But if you learn how to hold that in a gentle way, you can walk through that and still have a vital, long life.
Yeah, so it actually could actually lead to greater richness in a person's life, actually, couldn't it?
Exactly, and people who do go through this process often will say that they've learned a lot from doing it. We have a book on ACT for diabetes that's coming out probably around September, and so people who are dealing with that specific one, but there's ones for other illnesses as well, might look to how to go through that process. If you do it well, it can be a real lesson. Challenges, I think, can deepen us, enrich our lives, and not just be a weight or some oppressive thing.
Yeah. So you were talking about focusing on values and then moving your feet. So it's like someone says, oh my gosh, I'm just getting out of the hospital now. I've had a heart attack. I'm walking out of the hospital. I'm going back home. But rather than hiding under the covers, I've got kids, or I've got a spouse, or I've got a meaningful job. So we focus on values and we get moving. We don't allow the illness to overtake our life or to paralyze us.
That's right. And if you think about it, let's take the diabetes example. There's a difference between simply trying to avoid loss of limbs or blindness on the one hand, or being there for your grandchildren on the other. One is very, very much richer, more human, more passionate. And if people can connect to what they want to do with their life and really have this process of disease management be about that, then it lightens the burden. It dignifies the difficulties. That it's not an end in and of itself, but this is a means to being able to empower your life and do the things you want to do.
Yeah, so when you're talking about empowerment, I mean, I can imagine someone who's just received the information from their doctor that they have this chronic illness and that there are things they're going to need to do. And in fact, they might be even more committed then to being a loving husband or a loving wife or a loving father or making a difference in the world, whereas before they might have taken it for granted.
Exactly, and you hear those stories many times. People who faced loss, challenges, physical challenges, people who died close to them, saying that.
Yeah.
On the other hand, other people are really crushed by it. So how do you go from one column to the other?
Yeah.
And it turns out, we know from the research that it's some of these acceptance, mindfulness, and values-based processes will help keep you in the right column.
We're talking about how to gracefully and courageously deal with chronic illness. And we've been talking about dealing with physical illness like heart disease and diabetes, but now we want to turn and focus on depression and anxiety and other mental health issues. Can you talk with us, Dr. Hayes, about how ACT can be helpful for people suffering with those chronic illnesses?
Well, the ACT research is sort of amazingly broad. The same basic formula seems to work in many areas, but there's one thing that is different, which is in some of the physical illnesses, like diabetes, it's likely that you're going to be dealing with that for the rest of your life. Anxiety and depression, it turns out that some of these methods will actually prevent the development of further recurrences of anxiety and depression and will help shorten the episodes. So it's not just a matter of managing, it's also a matter of releasing and moving on from it, of a depressive or anxiety-focused way of being in the world. But the same basic message is there, and it turns out that it's curative and prophylactic. It actually helps release us from these processes and will prevent their reoccurrence, to bring acceptance, mindfulness, and values-based action to them.
Could you kind of give us an example maybe of someone that might have depression or someone that might have anxiety and how you might work with them in walking through those steps?
Well, let's take depression, for example. There's a tendency for people very often to socially withdraw or to no longer engage in things that they used to find enjoyable or interesting. Of course, that's the exact opposite of what you need to do. But it is initially difficult to do a 180 and to make a call when you don't feel like it, to reach out for others when it isn't just emotionally feels natural to do that. So they're teaching people the acceptance and mindfulness methods so you can watch these kind of depressive chatter that's going on without entanglement, without fighting it, without arguing back, but just noticing it. It's habitual, it's there. And to notice, for example, the feelings of lethargy or sadness, and what do you really want your life to be about? So you focus on the actions that are important to you and getting you involved in your life, getting going. And it turns out That's probably the single most healthy thing that you can do. Behavioral activation, getting out and doing the things that are meaningful to you, is probably the single best thing you can do in depression. A similar thing happens in anxiety. It's a little bit different, a little more emotion focused, but it's the same basic message of learning to feel those feelings and watch the thoughts will help shorten these kinds of episodes and will prevent their reoccurrence in the future.
So as I'm hearing you talk about that, what comes to my mind, it's like someone having their depression without their depression having them.
Exactly. Exactly. So, whose life is this anyway?
Yeah, so they have a chance to have a life, huh?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there, sometimes people will actually say, I am depressed or I am agoraphobic, and people can get into a role in which almost it becomes your identity.
Yeah.
And that's another thing you have to let go of, is the attachment to that thought. No, you've had some struggles, but you can, moment by moment, with your feet, with your actual behavior, create the kind of life that you want to create. And if you let your behavior be the engine and emotions and thoughts be the exhaust instead of the other way around, then you've got a lot more energy and ability to move